Hi, this is a new series about Schopenhauer. I will be reading his short work on the sufferings of the world and offering some of my commentary. This comes from a book titled Studies in Pessimism, some of Schopenhauer's late writings translated by T. Bailey Saunders in the 1890s. Let me tell you a little bit about Mr. Saunders. Thomas Bailey Saunders was a British barrister. He did little original work, but he was known and well respected for his translations of Schopenhauer and Harnack into English. These were thought to be quite readable and quite popular. Saunders, I'll be reading, by the way, from this book of essays of Schopenhauer. Saunders offers a translator's note to the beginning of this volume, Studies on Pessimism, explaining a little bit about this work and its origin. So here's what Saunders writes. The first essay is, in the main, a rendering of the philosopher's remarks under the heading Nachträge zur Lehre vom Leiden der Welt, together with certain parts of another section entitled Nachträge zur Lehre vom der Bejahung und Verneinung des Willens zum Leben. So what Saunders has done is to take two parts of Schopenhauer's Peroga, a work of short writings from about 1850, and combined them and edited them together himself in translating them. Those two titles are roughly Additional Remarks on the Doctrine of the Suffering of the World and Additional Remarks on the Doctrine of the Affirmation and Denial of the Will to Live. Saunders also says, such omissions as I have made are directed chiefly by the desire to avoid repeating arguments already familiar to readers of the other volumes in this series. So the text we're going to get here under the title On the Sufferings of the World is Saunders' title with Saunders combining two sets of aphoristic additional remarks by Schopenhauer in his translation. So with that caveat that we're getting kind of Schopenhauer filtered by T. Bailey Saunders, let's start the text. This, by the way, is 18 pages long in this version. I'll be taking it in a couple of parts. On the sufferings of the world. Unless suffering is the direct and immediate object of life, our existence must entirely fail of its aim. It is absurd to look upon the enormous amount of pain that abounds everywhere in the world, and originates in needs and necessities inseparable from life itself, as serving no purpose at all, and the result of mere chance. Each separate misfortune as it comes seems no doubt to be something exceptional, but misfortune in general is the rule. I know of no greater absurdity than that propounded by most systems of philosophy in declaring evil to be negative in its character. Evil is just what is positive. It makes its own existence felt. Leibniz is particularly concerned to defend this absurdity, and he seeks to strengthen his position by using a palpable and paltry sophism. It is the good which is negative. In other words, happiness and satisfaction always imply some desire fulfilled and some state of pain brought to an end. So that's the first page, first two paragraphs of this text. And we have here, I think, another iteration of the main axis of Schopenhauer's practical philosophy. Pain and suffering are real. They are the positive element in life that truly exists. And happiness and pleasure are a negative fact defined in relation to that positive existence. They are the cessation of pain. And to forget that, or to live a sort of a fantastical, optimistic philosophy like Leibniz's, is to go fundamentally wrong in orienting yourself to the actual world in which you live. So Schopenhauer here is going to recommend many things under the heading of his general pessimism, saying at the beginning, of course, that unless we make suffering the direct and immediate aim of our object of our life, unless we sort of put that front and center as what we are going to be going through, we will find life to be absurd. So let's go on. Next page. This explains the fact that we generally find pleasure to be not nearly so pleasant as we expected, and pain very much more painful. The pleasure in this world, it has been said, outweighs the pain. Or at any rate, there is an even balance between the two. If the reader wishes to see shortly whether this statement is true, let him compare the respective feelings of two animals, one of which is engaged in eating the other. Schopenhauer has turned here to talk about our subjective experience of pleasure and pain. We have we generally find that the pleasures of life are good, but they're not as good as we had kind of hoped, and the pains of life are much more painful than we had wished that they might be. Why is that? That's because of this fundamental mistake that many of us are making in being optimistic rather than pessimistic. And then this kind of brutal observation, right? It is generally thought that there's more pleasure than pain in the world, or at least we break even. The truth is quite the opposite, that there is vastly more pain and suffering in this world than pleasure. And the image then, two animals, one of which is eating the other. Well, one is getting some pleasure out of consuming a meal. The other is suffering, but the magnitude of the suffering is vastly more than the magnitude of the pleasure on the part of the eater. So that's Schopenhauer, I think, has a kind of talent for clear expression and for really punchy images like that one. Going back to the text now. The best consolation in misfortune or affliction of any kind will be the thought of other people who are in a still worse plight than yourself. And this is a form of consolation open to everyone. But what an awful fate this means for mankind as a whole. We are like lambs in a field, disporting themselves under the eye of the butcher, who chooses out first one and then another for his prey. So it is that in our good days we are all unconscious of the evil fate may have presently in store for us: sickness, poverty, mutilation, loss of sight or reason. No little part of the torment of existence lies in this, that time is continually pressing upon us, never letting us take breath, but always coming after us like a taskmaster with a whip. If at any moment time stays his hand, it is only when we are delivered over to the misery of boredom. Okay. I'll pause here again on this second page. Schopenhauer here giving us another insight that although the experience of suffering may, for the individual, be ignorable, right? While I'm not currently in pain, I can pretend as though the coming pain is not something I really need to concern myself with. I can enjoy my moments of pleasure, or at least of respite from pain. The collective situation of humanity is rather terrible. So the situation of mankind is collectively awful, but individually endurable. That maybe is a good way of thinking about Schopenhauer's thought as a whole. And there's also this idea then that the pauses in our work when time ceases to drive us forward are then we leave one kind of suffering for another. We lapse into the state of boredom, where we're no longer able to find anything to distract ourselves. So a sort of inversion of some of what Pascal has to say about boredom, perhaps. Going on. But misfortune has its uses. For, as our bodily frame would burst asunder if the pressure of the atmosphere was removed, so, if the lives of men were relieved of all need, hardship, and adversity, if everything they took in hand were successful, they would be so swollen with arrogance that, though they might not burst, they would present the spectacle of unbridled folly. Nay, they would go mad. And I may say further that a certain amount of care or pain or trouble is necessary for every man at all times. A ship without ballast is unstable and will not go straight. Certain it is that work, worry, labor, and trouble form the lot of almost all men their whole life long. But if all wishes were fulfilled as soon as they arose, how would men occupy their lives? What would they do with their time? If the world were a paradise of luxury and ease, a land flowing with milk and honey, where every Jack obtained his Jill at once, and without any difficulty, men would either die of boredom or hang themselves. Or there would be wars, massacres, and murders, so that in the end, mankind would inflict more suffering on itself than it has now to accept at the hands of nature. So, another kind of bold statement here that misfortune is like the pressure of the atmosphere that holds us in, or like the ballast of a ship that keeps us steady. If all of our desires were satisfied, we would go mad. Or, even worse, if the whole human race experienced this sort of sudden prosperity, comfort, and total ease, a paradise of luxury and ease, men would go mad. They would start killing each other. They would hang themselves. They would commit violence, massacre, and murders. That in the end, they would inflict far more suffering on themselves than would have been inflicted by nature in the ordinary course of things. This is maybe something to contemplate in the age of prosperity and also profound unhappiness. So perhaps Schopenhauer has something here going on. In early youth, as we contemplate our coming life, we are like children in a theater before the curtain is raised, sitting there in high spirits and eagerly waiting for the play to begin. It is a blessing that we do not know what is really going to happen. Could we foresee it? There are times when children might seem like innocent prisoners, condemned not to death, but to life. And as yet, all unconscious of what their sentence means. Nevertheless, every man desires to reach old age, in other words, a state of life in which it may be said, "It is bad today, and it will be worse tomorrow," and so on, till the worst of all. Also, here again, Schopenhauer sounding rather bitter, but giving us a portrait, right? Children sitting, waiting for the curtain to rise. What is my life going to be like? And he's saying as an old man now, with a kind of old man's wisdom. They're excited and happy and optimistic because they don't know what's coming. They don't know what life has in store for them. But despite all of that, nobody wishes to end his life. Everybody wishes to go on enduring as well as he can endure. There again is another sort of portrait of life. It is suffering. If we acknowledge that and face it squarely, we have the strength to go on, as you might say, as pessimists. So, continuing. If you try to imagine, as nearly as you can, what an amount of misery, pain, and suffering of every kind the sun shines upon in its course, you will admit that it would be much better if, on the earth as little as on the moon, the sun were able to call forth the phenomena of life, and if, here as there, the surface were still in a crystalline state. Okay. It's a version of Schopenhauer's well-known statement that it would be better if there had been no life, if we had never been born. Again, you may look upon life as an unprofitable episode, disturbing the blessed calm of non-existence. And in any case, even though things have gone with you tolerably well, the longer you live, the more clearly you will feel that, on the whole, life is a disappointment, nay, a cheat. I'll pause again here for comment. Wow, a bit very hard sayings, some of these. The amount of misery, pain, and suffering on the earth should make us think that it would be better if the earth were as lifeless as the moon and as free of suffering as the moon. And that I wonder if any of us feel this or feel the opposite of it. You get on as tolerably as well as you can, but the older you get, the more you feel that life is something of a disappointment and a cheat, that you were promised more, you sort of hoped and expected more than you in fact got. Okay. I'm not sure here if Schopenhauer is thinking here of the disappointment of the optimistic philosopher or simply a universal experience that we all have. It seems to be the latter. He's going to illustrate this next with two hypothetical cases, and here they are. If two men who were old friends in their youth meet again when they are old, after being separated for a lifetime, The chief feeling they will have at the sight of each other will be one of complete disappointment at life as a whole, because their thoughts will be carried back to that earlier time when life seemed so fair as it lay spread out before them in the rosy light of dawn. It promised so much, and then performed so little. This feeling will so completely predominate over every other that they will not even consider it necessary to give it words. But on either side it will be silently assumed, and form the groundwork of all they have to talk about. He who lives to see 2 or 3 generations is like a man who sits some time in the conjurer's booth at a fair, and witnesses the performance twice or thrice in succession. The tricks were meant to be seen only once, and when they are no longer a novelty and cease to deceive, their effect is gone. So here are these 2 hypothetical cases Schopenhauer uses to illustrate this idea that our existence is really kind of a ripple in what would otherwise better be an unbroken plane of non-existence. 2 old friends meet after a lifetime, and so what is so prominent in both their emotional lives is that life has been a disappointment. Thinking back to what they hoped for together as young men and what they've now achieved as older men, the whole thing seems to be such a profound disappointment that neither one of them has to give it voice, but it lies in the background of everything that they do as they reminisce and catch up. I don't know if Schopenhauer, writing this as an old man, is thinking of his own experiences or if he is speculating, but this certainly seems to fit with and give a fitting illustration of his overall philosophy of pessimism. The other one, I do like this image. This stays with me. These images of the theater. This is watching your children and grandchildren, watching young people as an adult and then as a middle-aged and an older person come up, see them rise up with hopes for the world and hopes for their life, is like watching a magic show for the second or for the third time. You know what the tricks are. Other people don't, and so they're still impressed. They're still really attentive and interested. And as you watch it, you may begin to think back, well, I guess that pulling the rabbit out of the hat was kind of fun the first time I saw it when I didn't know what it was all about. But now that I'm seeing it for the third time, it's underwhelming. It's even boring. So again, the suggestion that all of life is like that, really. So here's more Schopenhauer. Life is a task to be done. It is a fine thing to say defunctus est. It means that the man has done his task. If children were brought into the world by an act of pure reason alone, would the human race continue to exist? Would not a man rather have so much sympathy with the coming generation as to spare it the burden of existence? Or, at any rate, not to take it upon himself to impose that burden upon it in cold blood? That's the last I'm going to read here for today, but wow. Again, life is a task to be done, so when one reaches the end of his life, we say, well, he has finished his task. He's finished, his suffering has come to an end, not as a release, but as an accomplishment. Okay? He's now defunct or finished or out of business, and it's over for him. Good thing. It's a fine thing to be able to say this about someone. And this last, kind of, for me, very haunting statement as someone with children and now grandchildren, if children were brought into the world by pure reason, wouldn't sympathy with the recognition of the suffering that people will endure incline people not to have any children, to spare this generation the burden of existing? This is one thing for Schopenhauer to write in the 1850s, before the hormonal birth control revolution of the mid and late 20th century. But we might take a look at falling birth rates in our own time and place and reflect back upon Schopenhauer's insight. If people gain more and more deliberate rational control over bringing other human beings into existence, would their overall recognition of the suffering of the world cause them to bring about fewer of them? And this is seems to me rather grim for all of us sort of evaluating our own lives and for the human race in general, especially for societies with rapidly declining birth rates that are creating threats of social dislocation and economic problems in the near future. So, just an observation of mine. I'd like to say a little bit more about Schopenhauer's anti-natalism. A commenter just a little bit ago suggested that I should say more about this. This is the topic with which Schopenhauer ended the previous section that I did the first video on, suggesting that if human reproduction, if bringing children into the world were entirely a matter of will, if it were entirely within our voluntary control, people would have far fewer children. Schopenhauer suggests this supports his view that we all deep down know that there is vastly more suffering in the world than pleasure, that life on the whole is a kind of a mistake or a cheat, and that we would hesitate then to inflict existence upon other beings like ourselves if we were able to abstain from doing so. So that's certainly a very strong anti-natalist line, which may be, as my commenter suggested, a central pillar of Schopenhauer's thought. My own view on this, complete opposite. A hard pass from me on the anti-natalism. I'm strongly pro-natalist myself. I have 4 children. I have grandchildren now. I move in social circles with people who have more children than me, many of them. So I am, on the whole, pro-children, pro-babies, both in my own life and I think as a matter of social policy. I think children are a great source of joy and meaning, and I would recommend, other things being equal, I'd recommend that people have children rather than not. So I don't share this particular aversion or misanthropy of Schopenhauer, and that may make me a poor Schopenhauerian. I'm happy to read his text and to analyze it, but among the things I find value in his practical philosophy, the antinatalism is not one of them. I do think that if Schopenhauer had had children, had gotten married and had children himself, he might have been of a different mind, but then he wouldn't be the Arthur Schopenhauer that we know and admire. So that's my brief comment on natalism, just to put all my cards on the table. That's one place where I certainly part ways with Schopenhauer, both in my personal belief and in my general attitude towards life. So we may get to the metaphysical basis of that at some later time. Those are the first couple of pages of Schopenhauer's work, titled by Bailey Saunders on the sufferings of the world. I hope you've enjoyed it. Let's take a look at the next section of this essay. In this part of the essay, Schopenhauer is going to compare the pleasures and pains of human beings to the pleasures and pains of animals, of beasts, with a certain kind of advantage held in some ways by the beasts. He's going to talk first about the difference that reason makes in our own experience of pleasure and pain. He's going to say a little bit about the role of time and self-consciousness in the life of a beast and the life of a human being. And he's going to conclude this passage with some thoughts about pets and domestic animals, and especially our affection for them as human beings dealing with lower animals in our daily lives. Here's what he writes. I shall be told, I suppose, that my philosophy is comfortless, because I speak the truth. And people prefer to be assured that everything the Lord has made is good. Go to the priests, then, and leave philosophers in peace. At any rate, do not ask us to accommodate our doctrines to the lessons you have been taught. That is what those rascals of sham philosophers will do for you. Ask them for any doctrine you please, and you will get it. Your university professors are bound to preach optimism, and it is an easy and agreeable task to upset their theories. I'll just say parenthetically here, he certainly has Hegel in mind and certain Hegelians who will provide a German idealist interpretation of the core doctrines of North German Protestantism. He may even have Kant in mind, although Schopenhauer does admire Kant immensely in other writings. So, going on. I have reminded the reader that every state of welfare, every feeling of satisfaction is negative in its character. That is to say, it consists in freedom from pain, which is the positive element of existence. It follows, therefore, that the happiness of any given life is to be measured not by its joys and pleasures, but by the extent to which it has been free from suffering, from positive evil. If this is the true standpoint, the lower animals appear to enjoy a happier destiny than man. Let us examine the matter a little more closely. However varied the forms that human happiness and misery may take, leading a man to seek the one and shun the other, the material basis of it all is bodily pleasure or bodily pain. This basis is very restricted. It is simply health, food, protection from wet and cold, the satisfaction of the sexual instinct, or else the absence of these things. Consequently, as far as real physical pleasure is concerned, the man is not better off than the brute, except insofar as the higher possibilities of his nervous system make him more sensitive to every kind of pleasure, but also, it must be remembered, to every kind of pain. But then, compared with the brute, how much stronger are the passions aroused in him? What an immeasurable difference there is in the depth and vehemence of his emotions. And yet, in the one case as in the other, all to produce the same result in the end, namely, health, food, clothing, and so on. The chief source of all this passion is that thought for what is absent and future, which, with man, exercises such a powerful influence upon all he does. It is this that is the real origin of his cares, his hopes, his fears, emotions which affect him much more deeply than could ever be the case with those present joys and sufferings to which the brute is confined. In his powers of reflection, memory, and foresight, man possesses, as it were, a machine for condensing and storing up his pleasures and his sorrows. But the brute has nothing of the kind. Whenever it is in pain, it is as though it were suffering for the first time, even though the same thing should have previously happened to it times out of number. It has no power of summing up its feelings. Hence its careless and placid temper, how much it is to be envied. But in man, reflection comes in, with all the emotions to which it gives rise, and taking up the same elements of pleasure and pain which are common to him and the brute, it develops his susceptibility to happiness and misery to such a degree that at one moment the man is brought in an instant to a state of delight that may even prove fatal, at another to depths of despair and suicide. Okay, so I'll pause for just a moment to review what we've talked about. We've heard here that the physical basis of human happiness and misery is identical with the beast. It is the satisfaction of physical desires and comforts. It's the removal of physical pain, which is the key element in life. But with human beings, this is complicated by our powers of reflection and intelligence, which give us this sort of curse of memory and anticipation. His description of this is very apt. It's like a machine for condensing and processing and holding on to our pleasures and sorrows. And we might note simply there, if the pleasures in the world are vastly outnumbered by the sorrows and miseries of the world, having concentrated versions of both is actually worse overall. So human beings capable of greater pleasures and of greater miseries, but on the whole, that means a more miserable life altogether. There's also something he's going to develop in the next pages, this suggestion that the consciousness of animals is limited to the immediate present moment, where with human beings, we are spread out over a wider period of time. And this is, again, to our detriment in the matter of actually acquiring happiness and release from misery and pain. So we'll go on with Schopenhauer now. If we carry our analysis a step farther, we shall find that, in order to increase his pleasures, man has intentionally added to the number and pressure of his needs, which in their original state were not much more difficult to satisfy than those of the brute. Hence, luxury in all its forms, delicate food, and the use of tobacco and opium, spirituous liquors, fine clothes, and the 1,001 things that he considers necessary to his existence. And above and beyond all this, there is a separate and peculiar source of pleasure, and consequently of pain, which man has established for himself, also as the result of using his powers of reflection, and this occupies him out of all proportion to its value, nay, almost more than all his other interests put together. I mean, ambition and the feeling of honor and shame. In plain words, what he thinks about the opinion other people have of him. Taking 1,000 forms, often very strange ones, this becomes the goal of almost all the efforts he makes that are not rooted in physical pleasure or pain. It is true that besides the sources of pleasure which he has in common with the brute, man has the pleasures of the mind as well. These admit of many gradations, from the most innocent, trifling, or the merest talk, up to the highest intellectual achievements. But there is the accompanying boredom to be set against them on the side of suffering. Boredom is a form of suffering unknown to brutes, at any rate in their natural state. It is only the very cleverest of them who show faint traces of it when they are domesticated. Whereas in the case of man, it has become a downright scourge. The crowd of miserable wretches, whose one aim in life is to fill their purses but never put anything into their heads, offers a singular instance of this torment of boredom. Their wealth becomes a punishment by delivering them up to misery of having nothing to do. For, to escape it, they will rush about in all directions, traveling here, there, and everywhere. No sooner do they arrive in a place than they are anxious to know what amusements it affords, just as though they were beggars asking where they could receive a dole. Of a truth, need and boredom are the two poles of human life. Finally, I may mention that as regards the sexual relation, a man is committed to a peculiar arrangement which drives him obstinately to choose one person. This feeling grows now and then into a more or less passionate love, which is the source of little pleasure and much suffering. Footnote. I have treated this subject at length in a special chapter of the second volume of my chief work. I'll pause there and note that's chapter 44 of part 2, volume 2 of The World as Will and Representation. I have looked into that earlier today, and I have to tell you there's a lot of fascinating stuff in there. It's titled On the Metaphysics of Sexual Love. We might take a look at that in a later video. It's some very provocative thoughts and suggestions from Schopenhauer in that chapter. But to take a look back at these past 2 pages, we find that human beings have not only to suffer the sort of curse of intelligence and self-consciousness, which magnifies their pains and magnifies their pleasures, meaning more pain overall, but they've also invented new needs, new things to be pained at the lack of. He mentions tobacco and alcohol and other things that we consider now to be necessary. So these are things the animals wouldn't even contemplate seeking, much less lamenting their lack of, but here it is. We have invented more suffering for ourselves by inventing these luxury goods. And then his discussion of the opinion that other people have of us. Sounds very Rousseauian in its own way, that because we care about other people's opinion of us, now here's another source of misery for us, another source of striving and struggle and anxiously seeking to sort of scratch an itch that we've given to ourselves now in the form of this social reality that we present ourselves at. And then this final discussion of boredom again, that need and boredom are the two poles of human life. The suggestion that people now become wealthy and their wealth becomes a curse because they travel in order to find something to do, and then they seek like beggars for amusement, for what Pascal might call diversion, the minute that they arrive. Rather than being wealthy, they are most poor, we might say. They behave like people who are needy and scrabbling for scraps. So let's continue with Schopenhauer now. It is, however, a wonderful thing that the mere addition of thought should serve to raise such a vast and lofty structure of human happiness and misery, resting too on the same narrow basis of joy and sorrow as man holds in common with the brute, and exposing him to such violent emotions, to so many storms of passion, so much convulsion of feeling, that what he has suffered stands written and may be read in the lines of his face. And yet, when all is told, he has been struggling ultimately for the very same things as the brute has attained, and with an incomparably smaller expenditure of passion and pain. But all this contributes to increase the measures of suffering in human life out of all proportion to its pleasures, and the pains of life are made much worse for man by the fact that death is something very real to him. The brute flies from death instinctively without really knowing what it is, and therefore without ever contemplating it in the way natural to man, who has this prospect always before his eyes. So that even if only a few brutes die a natural death, and most of them live only just long enough to transmit their species, and then, if not earlier, become the prey of some other animal, whilst man on the other hand manages to make so-called natural death the rule, to which, however, there are a good many exceptions, the advantage is on the side of the brute, for the reasons stated above. But the fact that man attains the natural term of years just as seldom as the brute, but the fact is that man attains the natural term of years just as seldom as the brute, because the unnatural way in which he lives and the strain of work and emotion lead to a degeneration of the race, and so his goal is not often reached. The brute is much more content with mere existence than man. The plant is wholly so, and man finds satisfaction in it just in proportion as he is dull and obtuse. Accordingly, the life of the brute carries less of sorrow with it, but also less of joy, when compared with the life of man. And while this may be traced on the one side to freedom from the torment of care and anxiety, it is also due to the fact that hope, in any real sense, is unknown to the brute. It is thus deprived of any share in that which gives us the most and best of our joys and pleasures, the mental anticipation of a happy future, and the inspiring play of fantasy, both of which we owe to our power of imagination. If the brute is free from care, it is also in this sense without hope. In either case, because its consciousness is limited to the present moment, to what it can actually see before it. The brute is an embodiment of present impulses, and hence what elements of fear and hope exist in its nature, and they do not go very far, arise only in relation to objects that lie before it and within reach of those impulses. Whereas a man's range of vision embraces the whole of his life and extends far into the past and future. Following upon this, there is one respect in which brutes show real wisdom when compared with us. I mean their quiet, placid enjoyment of the present moment. The tranquility of mind which this seems to give them often puts us to shame for the many times we allow our thoughts and our cares to make us restless and discontented. And in fact, those pleasures of hope and anticipation which I have been mentioning are not to be had for nothing. The delight which a man has in hoping for and looking forward to some special satisfaction is a part of the real pleasure attaching to it enjoyed in advance. This is afterwards deducted, for the more we look forward to anything, the less satisfaction we find when it comes. But the brute's enjoyment is not anticipated, and therefore suffers no deduction, so that the actual pleasure of the moment comes to it whole and unimpaired. In the same way, too, evil presses upon the brute only with its own intrinsic weight, whereas with us the fear of its coming often makes its burden 10 times more grievous. So here is a bit more about the difference between humans and animals in regards to pleasure and pain, the difference that self-consciousness and consciousness of the past and the future, consciousness of one's own death makes. This makes us capable of far more miseries, also of hope, which is a source of pleasure. What we might also say of dashed hope, which is a source of misery. It seems to me that one way to think about this may be that just as animals lack a theory of mind for us, right? My dog doesn't really have a sense of me as a mind like its own looking back. Just as animals don't have a theory of mind for humans, animals don't really have a theory of mind for themselves. They don't really have a sense of themselves as enduring across time, as having experiences. I'm not going to try to explain just what I mean by that. If it resonates with you, then run with it. Um, so this awareness of death is another source of uniquely human source of misery. I do think that while Schopenhauer is correct about animals as the kind of distillation, the sort of the embodiment of the present tense, so that the things immediately in front of them are their only source, and sort of maybe in the immediate past and immediate future, are their only source of attention and therefore of pleasure and misery, often to their great benefit relative to us. I do think he's mistaken about this idea that anticipation and the pleasure of anticipation deducts from the actual enjoyment of the thing once it is achieved. I don't think I've found that to be the case in my own life, that the more I anticipate something, the less I enjoy it once I achieve it. I think Schopenhauer maybe has either made just a straight up mistake in describing human psychology, or he's maybe been lured by the desire to make a certain point, something like a point he made in Counsels and Maxims about the way in which we sort of take an advance upon certain goods that are coming to us in the future. So, from my own perspective, I would say I think he's probably wrong about that. So let's go back onto the text and finish this section. It is just this characteristic way in which the brute gives itself up entirely to the present moment that contributes so much to the delight we take in our domestic pets. They are the present moment personified, and in some respects they make us feel the value of every hour that is free from trouble and annoyance, which we, with our thoughts and preoccupations, mostly disregard. But man, that selfish and heartless creature, misuses this quality of the brute, to be more content than we are with mere existence, and often works it to such an extent that he allows the brute absolutely nothing more than mere bare life. The bird which was made so that it might rove over half the world, he shuts up into the space of a cubic foot, there to die a slow death in longing and crying for freedom, for in a cage it does not sing for the pleasure of it. And when I see how man misuses the dog, his best friend, how he ties up this intelligent animal with a chain, I feel the deepest sympathy with the brute and burning indignation against its master. We shall see later that by taking a very high standpoint, it is possible to justify the sufferings of mankind. But this justification cannot apply to animals, whose sufferings, while in a great measure brought about by men, are often considerable even apart from their agency. And so we are forced to ask, why and for what purpose does all this torment and agony exist? There is nothing here to give the will pause. It is not free to deny itself and so obtain redemption. There is only one consideration that may serve to explain the sufferings of animals. It is this, that the will to live, which underlies the whole world of phenomena, must in their case satisfy its cravings by feeding upon itself. This it does by forming a gradation of phenomena, every one of which exists at the expense of another. I have shown, however, that the capacity for suffering is less in animals than in man. Any further explanation that may be given of their fate will be in the nature of hypothesis, if not actually mythical in its character, and I may leave the reader to speculate upon the matter for himself. That's all I'm going to read from On the Sufferings of the World for today, but some thoughts about the attitude that we take, the pleasures and pains we take, the joys and delights that we take in the lives of our domestic animals, of our pets. It is precisely because they lack our particular anxiety, our hopes and memories that we find them so attractive and comforting to live with. It also indicates that there's a way in which their pleasures are kind of pure pleasures that we wish we could enjoy in the way that they do. And their pains, especially when they're inflicted by human beings, seem to be far more terrible and less justifiable. So there is this discussion here, getting a little bit into Schopenhauer's metaphysics, that the will at the animal level, at the brute level, is just self-consuming because it doesn't have the capability of rising up to any sort of greater act of redemption or self-understanding. So the animals doesn't have the psychological complexity to seek a kind of philosophical self-denial and self-annihilation. And so it has to simply go on being what it is, suffering in the way that it suffers, which is limited, thankfully, until its natural end. So those are the middle pages of Schopenhauer's essay on the sufferings of the world. I hope you've enjoyed my commentary on them. Hi. In these final pages of Schopenhauer's essay on the sufferings of the world from Studies in Pessimism, he begins by discussing Buddhist and Zoroastrian cosmology, a theory of the universe, and the place of human suffering in it. He argues strongly against the existence of any kind of benevolent creator god, like in the Jewish and Christian traditions. And then he articulates something which I think of as being an interesting world which contains sin, but no deity who is sinned against. There's no lawgiver whose rules we have broken that constitutes our sin. We'll take a look at what Schopenhauer says about that. And then, rather surprisingly to me, he identifies his own philosophy with true Christianity. He indicates that what is really ultimately true in the Christian view of the world is presented in a more complete form in his, Schopenhauer's, pessimistic philosophy. That's one place where students of Nietzsche might find an interesting convergence, where Nietzsche would reject both Schopenhauer and Christianity, perhaps in part because of this perceived continuity between them. And then he concludes this essay with a rather beautiful defense of the life philosophy of pessimism, especially in terms of its moral benefits to the person who becomes a pessimist. So we'll finish with that. But here's what Schopenhauer writes. Brahma is said to have produced the world by a kind of fall or mistake. And in order to atone for his folly, he is bound to remain in it himself until he works out his redemption. As an account of the origin of things, that is admirable. According to the doctrines of Buddhism, the world came into being as the result of some inexplicable disturbance in the heavenly calm of nirvana, that blessed state obtained by expiation, which had endured so long a time, the change taking place by a kind of fatality. This explanation must be understood as having at bottom some moral bearing, although it is illustrated by an exactly parallel theory in the domain of physical science, which places the origin of the sun in a primitive streak of mist formed one knows not how. Subsequently, by a series of moral errors, the world became gradually worse and worse, true of the physical orders as well, until it assumed the dismal aspect it wears today. Excellent. I'll pause here to note that Schopenhauer is giving us a portrait of Buddhism, according to which the world, in a sense, kind of falls into existence. Right? I think there's a sort of decline from the blessed state of peace and tranquility in nirvana into the world of struggle and strife and physical existence that we know today. Schopenhauer approves of this and notes that it is both physical and moral in its character. The world becomes worse and worse. The world becomes more and more, we might say, chaotic in a physical sense, greater and greater entropy. We are in a bad state progressing towards a worse state, and that's the very nature of this existence. So he goes on. The Greeks looked upon the world and the gods as the work of an inscrutable necessity. A passable explanation, we may be content with it until we can get a better. Again, Ormuzd and Ahriman are rival powers, continually at war. That is not bad. But that a god like Jehovah should have created this world of misery and woe out of pure caprice and because he enjoyed doing it, and should then have clapped his hands in praise of his own work and declared that everything to be declared everything to be very good, that will not do at all. In its explanation of the origin of the world, Judaism is inferior to any other form of religious doctrine professed by a civilized nation. And it is quite in keeping with this that it is the only one which presents no trace whatever of any belief in the immortality of the soul. Even though Leibniz's contention that this is the best of all possible worlds were correct, that would not justify God in having created it. For he is the creator not of the world only, but of possibility itself. And therefore, he ought to have so ordered possibility as that it would admit of something better. And I'll just note this is a standard atheist critique of theism, that if God is infinitely powerful, he could have created the world with a different possibility structure such that it wouldn't be as miserable as it is now. I'm not going to break open that question to try to examine and respond to it, but just note that Schopenhauer is writing in a well-trod lane at this point. Continuing. There are two things which make it impossible to believe that this world is the successful work of an all-wise, all-good, and at the same time all-powerful being. Firstly, the misery which abounds in it everywhere. And secondly, the obvious imperfection of its highest product, man, who is a burlesque of what he should be. These things cannot be reconciled with any such belief. On the contrary, they are just the facts which support what I have been saying. They are our authority for viewing the world as the outcome of our own misdeeds, and therefore as something that had better not have been. Whilst under the former hypothesis they amount to a bitter accusation against the Creator and supply material for sarcasm, under the latter they form an indictment against our own nature, our own will, and teach us a lesson of humility. They lead us to see that, like the children of a libertine, we come into the world with the burden of sin upon us, and that it is only through having continually to atone for this sin that our existence is so miserable, and that its end is death. Continuing here his critique of theism, of Christianity and Judaism, their belief in an omnipotent, benevolent creator God, Schopenhauer points out, as he said, two types of evidence. One, the misery of the world. Second, the imperfection of the highest being in the world, man. He calls him a burlesque of what he should be. My philosopher's ears prick up, and I wonder, what is the nature of that should? Where's the normative force of it come from? In what sense should man be better than the absurd being that he is? Perhaps Schopenhauer means he aspires to better, or we really have a deep sense that we ought to be better than we are, that our own existence by our very living out of it is falling short, as even being a kind of absurd parody of what a spiritual being would like to be. So that's interesting for me, and I think worth further thinking about. He says the sufferings of this world and the imperfection of man, on the assumption that God exists, these are an indictment of the Creator for making things this way. On Schopenhauer's assumption, this sort of more Buddhist assumption that this world is a mistake, the idea is that the mistake was ours. There's a sort of, this world and its suffering result from our own error, sin, and activity and striving, and that's the sense in which it makes sense to say that this world should not have been. It would be better if it were not. It would be better if we had not sinned, if we had not erred, if we had not fallen into this state of being. Continuing with Schopenhauer now. There is nothing more certain than the general truth that it is the grievous sin of the world which has produced the grievous suffering of the world. I am not referring here to the physical connection between these two things lying in the realm of experience. My meaning is metaphysical. Accordingly, the sole thing that reconciles me to the Old Testament is the story of the fall. In my eyes, it is the only metaphysical truth in that book, even though it appears in the form of an allegory. There seems to me no better explanation of our existence than that it is the result of some false step, some sin of which we are paying the penalty. I cannot refrain from recommending the thoughtful reader a popular, but at the same time profound treatise on this subject by Claudius, which exhibits the essentially pessimistic spirit of Christianity. It is entitled, "Cursed is the ground for thy sake." Translator's footnote. Matthias Claudius, 1740 to 1815, a popular poet and friend of Klopstock, Herder, and Lessing. He edited the Wandsbeker Bote, in the fourth part of which appeared the treatise mentioned above. He generally wrote under the pseudonym of Asmus, and Schopenhauer often refers to him by this name. I think that's quite interesting. Cursed is the ground for thy sake by Matthias Claudius. Perhaps I'll look that up and we'll take a look at it later on. Between the ethics of the Greeks and the ethics of the Hindus, there is a glaring contrast. In the one case, with the exception, it must be confessed, of Plato, the object of ethics is to enable a man to lead a happy life. In the other, it is to free and redeem him from life altogether, as is directly stated in the very first words of the Sankhya Karika. Allied with this is the contrast between the Greek and the Christian idea of death. It is strikingly presented in a visible form on a fine antique sarcophagus in the gallery of Florence, which exhibits in relief the whole series of ceremonies attending a wedding in ancient times, from the formal offer to the evening when Hymen's torch lights the happy couple home. Compare with that the Christian coffin, draped in mournful black and surmounted with a crucifix. How much significance there is in these two ways of finding comfort in death. They are opposed to each other, but each is right. The one points to the affirmation of the will to live, which remains sure of life for all time, however rapidly its forms may change. The other, in the symbol of suffering and death, points to the denial of the will to live, to redemption from this world, the domain of death and devil. And in the question between the affirmation and the denial of the will to live, Christianity is, in the last resort, right. Here, I think we see maybe the most fundamental fissure between Schopenhauer's philosophy and Nietzsche's, where Nietzsche would celebrate the will to live. We would expect, hearing this description, knowing Nietzsche, to see him praise the fact that the sarcophagus, which is an artifact of death, is decorated with these elements to remind us of the glory of life, of a wedding, of the beginning of a wedding, of the end of a wedding, of all the things that are the joys of life, affirming the will to live, even on the artifact and the institution of death, the sarcophagus, which contains the corpse. And then the Christian coffin, it's somber, it's dark, it contains only a simple crucifix on it with its corpus, its symbol of the tortured and dead Jesus. And Schopenhauer here, maybe quite opposite to Nietzsche, what we expect of Nietzsche, says, actually, the Christians have this one right. The denial of this will to live, of the will to live in this world, is, in fact, valuable, maybe the most valuable thing about the Christian view of life. So if we wanted to put Nietzsche side by side with Schopenhauer, I think this would be a text that would absolutely allow us to do so. So going on with what Schopenhauer writes. The contrast which the New Testament presents when compared with the Old, according to the ecclesiastical view of the matter, is just that existing between my ethical system and the moral philosophy of Europe. The Old Testament represents man as under the dominion of the law, in which, however, there is no redemption. The New Testament declares law to have failed, frees man from its dominion, and in its stead preaches the kingdom of grace, to be won by faith, love of neighbor, and entire sacrifice of self. This is the path of redemption from the evil of the world. The spirit of the New Testament is undoubtedly asceticism, however your Protestants and rationalists may twist it to suit their purpose. Asceticism is the denial of the will to live, and the transition from the Old Testament to the New, from the dominion of law to that of faith, from justification by works to redemption through the mediator, from the domain of sin and death to eternal life in Christ means, when taken in its real sense, the transition from the merely moral virtues to the denial of the will to live. My philosophy shows the metaphysical foundation of justice and the love of mankind, and points to the goal to which those virtues necessarily lead, if they are practiced in perfection. At the same time, it is candid in confessing that a man must turn his back upon the world, and that the denial of the will to live is the way of redemption. It is therefore really at one with the spirit of the New Testament, whilst all other systems are couched in the spirit of the Old. That is to say, theoretically as well as practically, their result is Judaism, mere despotic theism. In this sense, then, my doctrine might be called the only true Christian philosophy. However paradoxical a statement this may seem to people who take superficial views instead of penetrating to the heart of the matter. I'll pause here again for a brief comment. Really, Schopenhauer has laid it out very directly here, right? The contrast between the New and the Old Testament, think of it as the contrast between Schopenhauer's philosophy, that's the New Testament, denial of the will to live, the triumph of asceticism, and the Old Testament, man under the dominion of the law, or his great expression here, mere despotic theism, which identifies with Judaism, I think maybe in a similar way to Nietzsche and most 19th century Germans, I expect. And here also Schopenhauer defends the idea that our ultimate path of redemption from the suffering of this world will be something like what Christianity recommends, a sacrifice of self, a living for others, a denial of the will to live, or perhaps as I put it just a bit ago, a denial of the will to live in this world. But the true metaphysical basis of this is not a transition to some heavenly state as a sort of reward, we might think, from a crude perspective, but rather a transition towards non-existence, something much more Buddhist in its sort of fundamental metaphysics. So, taken in its very real sense, Christianity is about the transition from the moral virtues, obedience to the law, with which we might also identify Kant among modern philosophers, transition from that to the more radical denial of the will to live and the living out this will against life. We can already see Nietzsche, this is something that if we know Nietzsche will reject vigorously in favor of the will to power, which he calls the will to life, the will to live most fully and to exercise your power to strive and win in this world. Schopenhauer is saying, no, that's the path to misery, to frustration. The path away from it is the path towards peace and tranquility, inside as well as in action. So, going on. If you want a safe compass to guide you through life and to banish all doubt as to the right way of looking at it, you cannot do better than accustom yourself to regard this world as a penitentiary, a sort of penal colony, or ergasterion, as the earliest philosopher called it. The footnote here is to Clement of Alexandria, by the way. Amongst the Christian fathers, Origen, with praiseworthy courage, took this view, which is further justified by certain objective theories of life. I refer not to my own philosophy alone, but to the wisdom of the ages, as expressed in Brahmanism and Buddhism, and in the sayings of Greek philosophers like Empedocles and Pythagoras, as also by Cicero in his remark that the wise men of old used to teach that we come into this world to pay the penalty of a crime committed in another state of existence, a doctrine which formed part of the initiation into the mysteries. And Vanini, whom his contemporaries burned, finding that an easier task than to confute him, puts the same thing in a very forcible way. Man, he says, is so full of every kind of misery that, were it not repugnant to the Christian religion, I should venture to affirm that if evil spirits exist at all, they have passed into human form and are now atoning for their crimes. And true Christianity, using the word in its right sense, also regards our existence as the consequence of sin and error. If you accustom yourself to this view of life, you will regulate your expectations accordingly, and cease to look upon all its disagreeable incidents, great and small, its sufferings, its worries, its misery, as anything unusual or irregular. Nay, you will find that everything is as it should be, in a world where each of us pays the penalty of existence in his own peculiar way. Amongst the evils of a penal colony is the society of those who form it. And if the reader is worthy of better company, he will need no words from me to remind him of what he has to put up with at present. If he has a soul above the common, or if he is a man of genius, he will occasionally feel like some noble prisoner of state, condemned to work in the galleys with common criminals, and he will follow his example and try to isolate himself. Another repetition here of a standard theme we find in Schopenhauer's practical philosophy, that the man of genius or superior spirit will necessarily be isolated from his fellows. The metaphor here, quite a memorable one. He will feel like a noble prisoner, like, say, a prince or a dispossessed king who has been thrown into the galleys, into the mines, with to do manual labor with people of a very different class from himself. And like such a character in fiction, he will find that the only way really to maintain himself is to isolate himself and withdraw from the society of his fellow people. Or the great line, right? One of the evils of a penal colony is the society of the people in it. You're forced to live among criminals and fellow criminals. I also just want to repeat what I think is a great line in this paragraph. Each of us pays the penalty of existence in his own peculiar way. I like that very much. Going on now to the end of this chapter. In general, however, it should be said that this view of life will enable us to contemplate the so-called imperfections of the great majority of men, their moral and intellectual deficiencies, and the resulting base type of countenance, without any surprise, to say nothing of indignation, for we shall never cease to reflect where we are, and that the men about us are beings conceived and born in sin, and living to atone for it. That is what Christianity means in speaking of the sinful nature of man. Pardons the word to all. That's a quote from Shakespeare's Cymbeline. Whatever folly men commit, be their shortcomings or their vices what they may, let us exercise forbearance, remembering that when these faults appear in others, it is our follies and vices that we behold. They are the shortcomings of humanity, to which we belong, whose faults, one and all, we share. Yes, even those very faults at which we now wax so indignant, merely because they have not yet appeared in ourselves. They are faults that do not lie on the surface, but they exist down there in the depths of our nature, and should anything call them forth, they will come and show themselves just as we now see them in others. One man, it is true, may have faults that are absent in his fellow, and it is undeniable that the sum total of bad qualities is in some cases very large, for the difference of individuality between man and man passes all measure. In fact, the conviction that the world and man is something that had better not have been is of a kind to fill us with indulgence towards one another. Nay, from this point of view, we might well consider the proper form of address to be not Monsieur, Sir, mein Herr, but my fellow sufferer, soci malorum, compagnon de misère. This may perhaps sound strange, but it is in keeping with the facts. It puts others in a right light, and it reminds us of that which is, after all, the most necessary thing in life: the tolerance, patience, regard, and love of neighbor, of which everyone stands in need, and which, therefore, every man owes to his fellow. That's the conclusion of the essay on the sufferings of the world. And as I said at the beginning, I think it's a very beautiful and even eloquent defense of pessimism as a life philosophy. When we are pessimistic, we will cease to be surprised and very much cease to be indignant or angry at the failings of other people. We will recognize their failings as the common failings of the human race, as sins that we have not committed only because we haven't had the opportunity or the disposition yet. But by identifying with the errors and sins and the sort of horror of mankind, we acquire a certain kind of indulgence and respect. And he says, even love of neighbor, not what you might expect from a cynic, from a pessimist who you might expect to become a cynic and a misanthrope. This is what, in a previous video, I think I called Schopenhauer's almost philanthropic misanthropy. That doesn't make any sense, of course, it's a paradox, but there's this way in which a recognition of the truly awful state of our affairs frees us from any hope of making it better, and it also makes us much more sympathetic and kind towards the people we live among, even as we are kind of withdrawing from them, perhaps inwardly. So that is the conclusion of this essay. I hope you found this video helpful and rewarding. I'll try to get into some other essays from Studies in Pessimism in future videos. Thanks for watching today. Goodbye.